The air in the grand dining room of Belle Reve was as thick and still as the Mississippi mud that bordered the sprawling cotton fields. It clung to Ilara's skin, a damp shroud beneath her silk gown, making the fine hairs on her arms prickle. Across the polished mahogany table, her husband, Silas, watched her. His eyes, the color of burnt coffee and just as bitter, held a possessive gleam that had long ago ceased to feel like affection and had curdled into something akin to ownership. "You were lingering by the west paddocks again today, Ilara," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the heavy silver cutlery. It was not a question. It was an accusation dressed in the finery of observation. Ilara placed her fork down with deliberate care, the tines clicking softly against the porcelain plate. She had learned that any sudden movement, any hint of defensiveness would only feed the beast of his suspicion. "The magnolias are in full bloom," she replied, her tone as smooth and placid as the surface of the nearby Yazoo River. "Their scent is a balm on these warm afternoons." Silas's lips thinned into a bloodless line. He was a man carved from hard angles and harder opinions, the master of Belle Reve and all the souls, black and white, who resided upon its 3,000 acres. His world was one of order, of possession, and Ilara was his most prized, most troublesome asset. "It is the overseer's scent you find so intoxicating, I believe, Mr. Cole?" The name hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp. Jasper Cole. He had been at Belle Reve for a year, a man as different from Silas as the cool shade of an oak was from the blistering sun of the open fields. Where Silas was all rigid control and simmering anger, Jasper was quiet competence. He moved with an easy grace, his shoulders broad from work, not from the entitled indolence of the planter class. And his eyes, they were the color of a summer sky just before a storm, a startling, piercing blue that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed facade Ilara presented to the world. "Mr. Cole was overseeing the repair of the fences," she said, forcing herself to meet her husband's gaze. "I merely exchanged a pleasantry as I passed. It would be unseemly for the mistress of the plantation to ignore the staff, would it not? Unseemly is allowing a man of his station to look upon you with such familiarity," Silas retorted, his knuckles white as he gripped his wine goblet. "I see the way he watches you, like a common stray eyeing a piece of meat left on the stoop." Ilara's stomach tightened into a cold knot. It was true. She had felt Jasper Cole's eyes on her, but it was not the leering gaze of a common stray. It was something else, something deeper and more unsettling. It was a look of recognition, as if he saw the woman suffocating beneath the whalebone corset and layers of silk. It was a look that made her feel, for a fleeting moment, like Ilara again. Not just Mrs. Silas Blackwood. She dismissed the thought as she dismissed her husband's paranoia. It was a fantasy, a dangerous one. "You are imagining things, Silas, as you so often do when your brandy has been too close a companion." She gave a small, brittle laugh, a sound that held no mirth. "Perhaps you should concern yourself more with the falling price of cotton, and less with the fanciful workings of your own mind." His eyes narrowed. He hated when she mentioned the plantation's finances, a subtle reminder that her dowry had saved Belle Reve from the brink of ruin 5 years ago. He had married her for her father's money, and she had married him for the security his name provided. It was a transaction, not a romance. A truth they both acknowledged in the cold silence of their separate bedchambers. "Do not mistake my concern for fancy, my dear," he whispered, leaning forward, the candlelight casting demonic shadows across his face. "A wife's virtue is the cornerstone of a man's honor. I will not have mine questioned because you are careless with your smiles." The threat was clear, hanging in the air like the scent of cloying jasmine. Her reputation, her very existence, was tied to his honor. He would guard it with the same ruthless efficiency he used to run his plantation, and she was expected to be as compliant and productive as his most prized field hand. Later that night, Ilara stood on the veranda overlooking the moon-drenched gardens. The air was alive with the thrumming of cicadas and the distant, mournful sound of a spiritual being sung in the quarters. She wrapped her arms around herself, the silk of her peignoir cool against her skin. Silas was right about one thing. She had been lingering by the west paddocks. She had told herself it was for the magnolias, for a breath of air away from the oppressive stillness of the great house. But that was a lie she whispered to herself in the dark. She had gone because she knew Jasper Cole would be there. She had gone to feel the unsettling thrill of his sky-blue eyes upon her, a silent acknowledgement of her existence in a world where she felt increasingly invisible. She had dismissed her husband's accusations as the ravings of a jealous tyrant, but a small, treacherous part of her knew they were rooted in a truth she had not yet dared to admit, even to herself. The truth was that in the gilded cage of Belle Reve, the overseer's gaze was the only thing that made her feel alive. The quarterly gathering at Belle Reve was a performance, and Alara was its lead actress. The neighboring planters and their wives, the formidable Beauforts and the gossiping Pembrokes, filled the grand parlor, their laughter and chatter a brittle symphony against the backdrop of silent, scurrying house servants. It was an evening of feigned gentility, where fortunes were displayed, alliances were subtly tested, and reputations were scrutinized with the keen eye of a jeweler examining a flawless or flawed diamond. Alara moved through the throng with a practiced grace, her smile a perfect, unmoving fixture on her face. She discussed the weather, the latest Godey's Ladies book fashions, and the troubling rise of abolitionist sentiment in the North, all with the detached air of a woman born to this life. But beneath the surface, a current of anxiety ran cold and fast. Silas had been drinking since noon, his mood growing darker with each glass of bourbon. His eyes followed her, heavy and possessive, from across the room. "Ilara, my dear, your hydrangeas are simply the envy of the county," drawled Beatrice Pembroke, a woman whose face was a roadmap of fine lines from years of pursed-lip judgment. "You are too kind, Beatrice," Ilara replied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Old Moses has the true gift with them. I merely admire his work, as we all admire the work of our people," Beatrice said, fanning herself languidly. "Though one must keep a firm hand. I hear Silas has a new overseer, a Mr. Cole. My husband says he runs the fields with remarkable efficiency." Ilara's heart gave a painful lurch. "He is competent," she managed, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within. Just then, a commotion at the French doors leading to the veranda drew everyone's attention. One of the younger field hands, a boy of no more than 16, had stumbled while carrying a tray of iced tea, sending glasses shattering across the tiles. Silas was on him in an instant, his face a mask of fury. "You clumsy fool," he roared, his voice cutting through the polite chatter and silencing the room. He grabbed the boy by the collar, his knuckles stark white. "This is what I get for entrusting a simple task to your kind. You are good for nothing but breaking your backs in the sun." A collective gasp went through the ladies. Such a display was considered uncouth, a breach of the unspoken rule that the brutal machinery of their lives should remain unseen and unheard during social engagements. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. This was her house, and Silas's lack of control was a reflection on her. Before she could intervene, a calm voice cut through the tension. "It was an accident, sir. The boy meant no harm." Jasper Cole stood at the edge of the veranda, having just come up from the fields to give his end-of-day report. He was not dressed for a party. His boots were dusty, and his shirt was damp with the sweat of an honest day's labor. But he stood tall and unafraid, his startlingly blue eyes fixed on Silas. Silas whirled on him, shoving the terrified boy aside. "This does not concern you, Cole. Go back to your fields and your people. I will handle the discipline in my own house." "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwood," Jasper said, his voice even but firm. "The boy is frightened. A harsh hand will only make him more so. Allow me to see to the mess." The air crackled with unspoken challenge. An overseer, a hired hand, was publicly contradicting the master. It was unthinkable. The guests watched, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Silas's face went from red to a blotchy purple. He looked from Jasper's unwavering gaze to Alara, who stood frozen near the fireplace. He saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Relief? Admiration? And his rage found a new target. He let go of the boy and took a menacing step toward his wife. "You see?" he hissed, his voice low enough for only those nearby to hear, but his venom was palpable. "He speaks to me as an equal, and he looks to you for approval. You have encouraged this insolence. Silas, you are making a scene." Alara whispered, her hands clenched at her sides. "You have had too much to drink." "Have I?" He sneered, his voice rising again. "Or have I simply had my eyes opened to the viper I have welcomed into my home and the snake who manages my fields? Perhaps you would prefer his company, Alara. A man of the dirt, for a woman of no honor." The insult, so public, so venomous, struck her with the force of a physical blow. The room fell into a mortified silence. Beatrice Pembroke's fan stopped its lazy fluttering. Alara could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She stood her ground, her spine rigid, her chin held high, but inside she was crumbling. She was trapped, utterly and completely. Jasper, seeing the devastation in her face, took a half-step forward, his hands clenched into fists. But he stopped himself, knowing that any further action would only bring catastrophic ruin upon them all. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent message for Alara to endure, to survive. Then, with a quiet, "Sir," he turned, motioned for the young servant to follow, and began cleaning the broken glass, his movements precise and controlled, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that had erupted around him. The party died a swift and awkward death. The guests, murmuring excuses, made their hasty departures, leaving a trail of whispers in their wake. Alara stood alone in the grand parlor, the scent of spilled tea and bourbon hanging in the air. Silas had not apologized. He had simply poured himself another drink and retreated to his study, slamming the door behind him. She had dismissed his accusations as drunken paranoia, but now she saw them for what they were. A cage he was building around her, bar by verbal bar. Tonight, he had shown their neighbors, their entire world, the first glimpse of that cage. The whispers on the veranda would follow her to church, to town, to every social call. They would cling to her like the ever-present humidity, a constant reminder of her husband's suspicion and her own precarious position. And worst of all, in the horrifying clarity of the evening's events, she recognized the truth of his accusation. She had encouraged Jasper Cole's insolence, not with words, but with a silent, desperate plea in her eyes, a plea to be seen, to be saved. The days following the disastrous party were thick with a cloying, unspoken tension. Silas treated Alara with a chilling politeness that was more unnerving than his overt anger. He was watching her, waiting. He had laid his trap in public, and now he was biding his time, confident that she would eventually ensnare herself. The great house of Bel Rev, once merely oppressive, now felt like a tomb, and Alara felt herself fading into its shadows, becoming as silent and ornamental as the porcelain figurines on the mantelpiece. To escape the suffocating atmosphere, she took to riding out in the late afternoons, her mare Willow, her only confidant. She avoided the west paddocks, the site of Silas's initial accusations, and instead followed a little-used path that wound through a grove of ancient, moss-draped oaks towards the river. It was here, in the dappled sunlight, that she could breathe, that she could feel the stirrings of the woman she used to be. One sweltering afternoon, as she rounded a bend in the path, she saw him. Jasper Cole was standing by the riverbank, his back to her, skipping stones across the water's surface. He was not supposed to be here. This part of the estate was far from the main fields of operation. He must have sought solitude just as she had. She should have turned Willow around. She should have ridden back to the house without a word. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to flee. But her hands, as if with a will of their own, pulled gently on the reins, bringing the mare to a halt. He heard the soft thud of hooves on the dirt path and turned. His sky-blue eyes widened in surprise when he saw her. He immediately straightened up, his posture shifting from one of quiet contemplation to that of the respectful overseer. He removed his hat, his dark hair curling slightly in the humidity. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice low and steady. "I apologize if I am trespassing. I did not expect to see anyone out this way." "You are not trespassing, Mr. Cole," Alara said, her voice softer than she intended. "These lands are as much a part of your work as the cotton fields. I am the one intruding on your peace." A faint smile touched his lips. A rare sight she had only ever glimpsed from a distance. "There is little peace to be had during picking season, ma'am." A moment's respite is all a man can ask for. An awkward silence fell between them, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the gentle lapping of the river. Ilara's mind raced. She should leave. She should offer a polite nod and ride away, but she was rooted to the spot, held captive by a conversation that consisted of more than just pleasantries about the weather. She found herself speaking, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "What happened at the party? I am sorry you were subjected to my husband's temper." Jasper looked down at the flat stone in his hand, turning it over and over. "A man like your husband has a right to his temper, Mrs. Blackwood. It is not my place to question it." "But you did," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You spoke up for that boy." He finally looked up, and his gaze was so direct, so intense, that she felt it like a physical touch. "Some things are more important than a man's place, ma'am. Fear is a poor tool for motivation. It breeds resentment, not respect." His words were a quiet condemnation of everything Belle Reve was built upon, of everything Silas stood for. He was speaking of managing the enslaved, but Ilara heard a deeper truth, one that resonated with the fear and resentment blooming in her own heart. He was talking about her. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls between them, mistress and overseer, planter's wife and hired hand, crumbled into dust. She was not Mrs. Blackwood, and he was not Mr. Cole. They were simply a man and a woman, two souls seeking refuge from a world that sought to crush them. Her eyes welled with tears she refused to shed. She thought of the books she read in secret, tales of faraway places and lives of purpose, of women who were cherished, not just owned. She thought of the endless, identical days that stretched before her, a lifetime of silent dinners and veiled accusations. Jasper saw it all in her eyes. He saw the loneliness, the quiet desperation, the intelligence and spirit being slowly suffocated, and his expression softened from one of respect to one of profound, aching empathy. He did not pity her. He saw her. He took a half-step closer, his hand slightly outstretched, as if to offer comfort, before he seemed to remember himself and let it drop to his side. "The world is a hard place, Ilara," he said, her name leaving his lips for the first time, a soft, forbidden sound. Hearing him speak her name was like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was rusted shut. A sob caught in her throat. She could not speak. She could only look at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. In that shared glance, 1,000 words were exchanged. An alliance was forged. A dangerous, unspoken promise was made. It was a moment of profound connection, as terrifying as it was beautiful. She finally found her voice, a shaky whisper. "I should go." "Yes," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. But neither of them moved. They stood there for a long moment, suspended in time, the world of Belle Reve and Silas and social convention fading away, until there was only the river, the rustling leaves of the oaks, and the impossible, undeniable truth that existed in the space between their eyes. It was the beginning of everything, and they both knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that it would also be the beginning of the end. The shared glance by the river had planted a seed. In the weeks that followed, it was nourished by the fertile ground of Ilara's growing discontent. She began to see Belle Reve not as her home, but as a stage upon which a cruel play was endlessly performed. And Silas was not merely a difficult husband. He was a tyrant, ruling his small kingdom with a casual brutality that turned her stomach. She had always known, of course. She had been raised in the South, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. The peculiar institution was the bedrock of her world, a thing to be accepted, not examined. The sounds of the whip were a distant, unpleasant part of the plantation's daily rhythm, like the crowing of the rooster or the ringing of the work bell. She had trained herself to ignore it, to focus on the running of the house, the ordering of supplies, the arrangement of flowers, the small sanctioned duties of a plantation mistress. But now, her ears were open, her eyes were open, and through them, she saw the stark contrast between her husband and his overseer. One blisteringly hot afternoon, she was arranging cool linens in the infirmary, a small brick building near the main house, when Silas stormed in. With him was a young woman named Sarah, one of the house servants, her face streaked with tears, her arm held at an awkward angle. "This one," Silas snarled, shoving Sarah forward, "claims she is with child and cannot perform her duties. She is lazy and defiant. I want you to examine her. If she is lying, I will make her regret it." Ilara's hand stilled. Sarah was barely 18, with gentle eyes that were now wide with terror. "Silas, this is not my place. Old Hattie is the one who tends to the women. Hattie is an old fool who coddles them." He spat. "You are my wife. You will do as I say. Determine if this is a real ailment or a fiction designed to shirk her work." He was testing her, asserting his dominance in this small, cruel way. With trembling hands, Ilara led Sarah behind a privacy screen. The girl's arm was already beginning to swell. It was clear to Ilara that it had been twisted, violently. "He did this to you?" Ilara whispered, her heart aching. Sarah just sobbed, a low, keening sound of pure despair. "I am with child, mistress. It is true. I swear it on my mother's grave. But he would not believe me." Ilara felt a wave of nausea. The child was likely Silas's own, a product of the grim, unspoken power he wielded over every woman on the plantation. Her husband's hypocrisy was a suffocating stench. He demanded absolute purity from his wife while treating the women he owned as his personal property. She emerged from behind the screen, her face a pale, determined mask. "She is telling the truth, Silas. And her arm is injured. She will be of no use to you in the fields or the house until it is mended." Silas's eyes narrowed, searching her face for any sign of deception. He had expected her to be his accomplice, to validate his cruelty. Her quiet defiance infuriated him. "Fine," he bit out. "She can lie in the quarters and rot for all I care. But when she is well, she will learn the cost of her weakness." He turned and strode out, leaving a trail of cold fury in his wake. Later that day, from her bedroom window, Ilara saw Jasper Cole walking toward the infirmary. He carried a small basket. Peeking out from under a cloth was what looked like a jar of salve and some clean bandages. He spoke quietly with Hattie, the elderly woman who served as the plantation's midwife and healer, before leaving the basket with her. He had seen, he had heard, and where Silas had brought only pain and fear, Jasper brought a small, clandestine act of kindness. It was a pattern that repeated itself. She saw him speaking to the field hands not with curses and threats, but with quiet instructions, demonstrating a technique rather than punishing a mistake. She saw him ensure the water barrels were kept full during the hottest parts of the day, a simple act of humanity that Silas would have dismissed as a waste of time. He was still an overseer. His job was to extract labor, and the whip was still a tool of his trade. But he wielded his power with a reluctance and a measure of dignity that was a world away from Silas's sadistic pleasure in domination. This growing awareness poisoned everything. The lavish meals she ate felt obscene when she thought of the meager rations doled out in the quarters. The beautiful silk of her gowns felt like a shroud when she saw the sweat-soaked, threadbare shifts of the women in the fields. The entire foundation of her life, the wealth and comfort she had taken for granted, was built on a mountain of human suffering, a mountain ruled over by her husband. Her disillusionment was a chasm, and on the other side stood Jasper Cole. He was part of the system, yes, but he navigated it with a conscience Silas utterly lacked. He represented a different kind of manhood, one not defined by brute force and ownership, but by a quiet strength and a capacity for compassion. The seed of discontent had taken root, and it was growing into a thorny vine of rebellion, wrapping itself around her heart. She no longer dismissed Silas's accusations because she thought them untrue, but because she was beginning to wish they were true. She was beginning to crave the solace and understanding she saw in the overseer's sky-blue eyes. She was no longer just a lonely wife in a gilded cage. She was a woman on the verge of shattering it, whatever the cost. The desire for another stolen moment became a fever in Ilara's blood. It was a dangerous, reckless craving, but it was the only thing that made her feel the slightest bit alive in the suffocating stasis of her life. The great house was a pressure cooker of Silas's moods, his silent glares and cutting remarks a constant torment. He knew he was losing his grip on her, and it made him clamp down all the harder. He forbade her afternoon rides, claiming the heat was unsuitable for a lady of her delicate constitution. He questioned the household accounts with a new, vicious scrutiny, implying she was incompetent or, worse, deceitful. Every move he made was designed to isolate her, to clip her wings until she forgot she had ever known how to fly. But he had miscalculated. His tyranny did not break her spirit, it hardened it. It transformed her longing for a kind word from Jasper into a desperate, unyielding need. She learned his routines. She knew he inspected the northernmost fields, near the edge of the swamp, at the end of each day, long after the field hands had been marched back to the quarters. It was a remote and desolate place, shrouded in cypress trees and the eerie quiet of the marsh. No one went there willingly. It was the perfect, perilous sanctuary. One evening, as the sun began to bleed across the horizon in shades of orange and violet, she slipped out of the house. She had pleaded a headache, a common refuge, and retired to her room early. She wore a simple, dark-colored riding habit, forgoing the cumbersome hoops of her usual gowns. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and anticipation. Every rustle of the leaves sounded like an alarm. Every shadow seemed to hold the form of her husband. She found him by the edge of the swamp, just as she knew she would. He was on horseback, gazing out at the darkening landscape, a solitary figure against the fading light. He did not seem surprised to see her, as if he had been waiting, hoping. He dismounted as she approached, his blue eyes searching her face in the twilight. "Ilara," he breathed, the name a prayer and a warning. "You should not be here. This is a madness." "The madness is in that house," she said, her voice shaking as she slid from Willow's back. "Not here, not with you." She stood before him, the space between them humming with a powerful, unspoken energy. All the stolen glances, the shared moments of understanding, the silent condemnations of Silas's cruelty. It had all led to this. This was the precipice. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. His touch was not the rough, possessive grasp of Silas, but something reverent, questioning. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through her. It was the first time a man had touched her with tenderness in 5 years. A sob escaped her lips, and she leaned into his hand, closing her eyes. "He is a monster," she whispered, the confession she had never dared to speak aloud. "I know," Jasper said, his voice thick with a sorrow that mirrored her own. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I see what he does. I see what he is turning you into." "I am disappearing, Jasper," she confessed, her eyes opening to look into his. "I am becoming a ghost in my own home." "No," he said, his gaze intense. "I see you. I have seen you from the very first day." And then, there were no more words. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a release of all the pent-up loneliness, frustration, and forbidden desire that had been simmering between them for months. It was the taste of rebellion, the feel of freedom. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair. He was real. He was solid. He was everything Silas was not. His arms encircled her waist, lifting her effortlessly against him. He was strong, his body hardened by labor, a stark contrast to Silas's growing softness. He smelled of the earth, of sweat and leather, and the clean scent of the wind. He was life itself, raw and untamed. They moved as if in a dream, sinking down onto a bed of soft moss beneath the sheltering arms of a great cypress. The world fell away. There was no Belrev, no Silas, no society with its rigid, unforgiving rules. There was only the deepening twilight, the chorus of the swamp creatures, and the overwhelming, undeniable rightness of being in each other's arms. It was a frantic, desperate act of claiming, a way of pushing back against a world that sought to deny them their very humanity. For Ilara, it was a reclamation of a body that had been treated as property, a vessel for producing an heir. With Jasper, she was not an object, but a participant, a woman with desires and a will of her own. Afterward, they lay in the near darkness, their bodies still entwined, the humid air cooling on their skin. The madness of what they had done began to seep in, a cold tide of reality. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice laced with awe and terror. Jasper held her tighter, his lips against her hair. "We have lived," he answered simply. "For one moment, we have truly lived." He was right. But as she lay there, listening to the steady beat of his heart against her ear, a chilling thought intruded. They had lived for a moment, but that moment had cost them everything. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. This stolen moment of pure, unadulterated life had sown the seeds of their certain destruction. The thought was terrifying, but as she pressed herself closer to him, she found she could not bring herself to regret it. The stolen moment in the swamp became a stolen hour, then another, and another. Their secret affair was a dangerous addiction, a sliver of light in the ever-darkening world of Bel Rev. They met in their hidden sanctuary, their conversations as vital as their physical intimacy. Jasper spoke of his life before Bel Rev, of a small farm in the hills of Tennessee, of a family lost to fever. He spoke of a dream of heading west to California, where a man's worth wasn't measured by the number of souls he owned. He saw a future, a concept Ilara had long ago abandoned for herself. In turn, she spoke of the books she read, of the ideas that fascinated her, of the intellectual curiosity that Silas had derided as an unwomanly affectation. With Jasper, she was not just a beautiful, well-bred wife. She was a person, with a mind and a heart that he treated with a gentle respect that was utterly foreign to her. Their connection deepened, transcending the initial desperate passion and blossoming into a genuine, albeit impossible, love. This new secret life forced Ilara to become a consummate actress. She learned to school her features into a mask of placid indifference. She endured Silas's tirades and his chillingly polite interrogations with a newfound steely resolve. The guilt was a constant companion, a heavy stone in her gut, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective love for Jasper and the precious, fleeting moments they shared. She was playing a deadly game, and the stakes were impossibly high. Then the world shifted on its axis. It began with a subtle change, a morning sickness she initially dismissed as a symptom of the oppressive summer heat. But it persisted. Her monthly courses, always as regular as the Plantation bell, failed to arrive. A dreadful, terrifying, and yet strangely thrilling suspicion began to dawn. Old Hattie, the healer, confirmed it. The old woman's dark, knowing eyes seemed to peer directly into Ilara's soul as she examined her. Hattie had seen everything there was to see at Bel Rev over her 70 years. She knew the secret currents that ran beneath the plantation's placid surface. "You with child, mistress?" Hattie said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper that held no judgment, only a deep, weary sadness. "About 2 months along, I'd say." The word struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. 2 months. Her mind raced back, calculating the dates of her secret meetings with Jasper and the infrequent, resentful encounters with her husband in his bedchamber. The timeline was a tangled, horrifying knot. Joy, fierce and primal, was her first reaction. A child, a baby to love and hold, a piece of life in this house of slow death. But that joy was immediately consumed by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. Whose child was it? She clung to the hope, the desperate, paper-thin possibility that it was Silas's. An heir would placate him, perhaps even soften him. A son would secure her position, fragile as it was. She tried to convince herself, repeating the lie over and over in the silent darkness of her room. It is Silas's child. It must be. But in her heart of hearts, she knew. She felt it with a certainty that defied all logic. The life growing inside her was a product of love, not of duty. It was a child of the swamp, conceived in a moment of desperate, beautiful rebellion. It was Jasper's. The weight of her deceit became a physical presence, a constant pressure on her chest that made it difficult to breathe. Every meal with Silas was an ordeal. His conversation, now that he knew of the pregnancy, was full of possessive pride. He spoke of my son, my heir, the future master of Bel Rev. Each word was a dagger in Ilara's heart. She would smile and nod and murmur her agreement, while inside, she was screaming. She had to tell Jasper. The next time they met, under the silvery light of a full moon, the words caught in her throat. He sensed her distress immediately. "What is it, Alara?" he asked, his hand coming up to cup her face, his blue eyes full of concern. "Has he harmed you?" "No," she whispered, turning her face to kiss his palm. She took a deep breath and met his gaze. "I am with child, Jasper." The joy that lit his face was instantaneous and breathtaking. He let out a soft laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated delight. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around. "A child! Ilara! A child!" His happiness was so pure, so untainted by the fear that was consuming her, that it broke her heart. She began to weep, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. He immediately set her down, his expression shifting to one of confusion and alarm. "What is it? Why do you cry? This is a blessing." "Is it?" she choked out, the terrible question finally escaping her lips. "Or is it a death sentence?" Silas believes it is his. He is overjoyed. He speaks of his heir. The reality of their situation crashed down upon him. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by the familiar shadow of fear and despair. He looked at her, then down at her still flat stomach, and the impossible damning question hung in the air between them. "Do you know?" He started, but couldn't finish the sentence. Ilara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. I can't know. I pray to God that it is his, Jasper, for the child's sake, for your sake." But as she spoke the words, she felt the lie in them. She was not praying for it to be Silas's child. A part of her, the truest, most honest part, wanted this baby to be a testament to the only love she had ever known. But that love, and the child it had created, would destroy them all. The weight of her deceit was no longer just her own. It was a shared burden, a secret that bound them together on a path to ruin. The child growing within her was no longer just a source of joy or fear. It was a ticking clock, counting down the months until a truth, one way or another, would be brought into the light. And Alara had a terrifying premonition that the light would not be merciful. The news of Alara's pregnancy transformed the atmosphere at Bel Rev. For a brief period, Silas's tyrannical watchfulness was replaced by a smug, proprietary pride. He paraded Alara before their neighbors, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, accepting their congratulations with the air of a king who has finally secured his dynasty. To the outside world, the Blackwoods were the picture of antebellum prosperity, a beautiful, expectant wife and a powerful, proud husband. But the truce was short-lived. The beast of Silas's suspicion had not been slain. It had merely been slumbering, and as Alara's body began to change, to swell with the new life inside her, the beast began to stir. It started with small things, a lingering analytical glance when she returned from a walk in the gardens, a sharp question about who she had spoken to during the day. He began to track the passage of time with a chilling precision, making casual remarks about the progression of her pregnancy that were laden with calculation. "You are showing quickly for 4 months, are you not?" he would comment, his eyes narrowed as he watched for her reaction. Ilara's life became a minefield. She had to be constantly on guard, her every word and action measured and rehearsed. Her secret meetings with Jasper ceased. The risk was too great. The only communication they could share was a fleeting, agonizing glance across a courtyard, a look filled with a universe of love, fear, and longing. The less she saw of Jasper, the more Silas seemed to see him everywhere. He began to find fault with the overseer's work, manufacturing reasons to lash out at him. One day, Alara witnessed it from the veranda. Silas was dressing Jasper down in the stable yard, his voice a furious roar that carried across the manicured lawns. The issue was trivial, a supposed discrepancy in the feed accounts, but Silas's rage was monumental. He was baiting Jasper, trying to provoke a reaction, to find an excuse to dismiss him, or worse. Jasper stood stoically, his face a grim mask, his hands clenched at his sides. He absorbed the verbal assault without a word of defense, his eyes fixed on a point just over Silas's shoulder. He knew, as Alara did, that this was not about the feed. It was about her. Silas was punishing the man he suspected, asserting his dominance over his rival in the most public way he could. The incident terrified Alara. She realized that Silas's suspicion was no longer a vague, paranoid fancy. It had found a target. He might not have proof, but in his mind, Jasper Cole was the serpent in his Eden. Her husband's torment became more psychological, more insidious. He would sit across from her at dinner, swirling the brandy in his glass, and tell her stories. He spoke of other planters, of wives who had been unfaithful, of the swift and terrible retribution that had followed. He told a gruesome tale of a woman sent to a sanatorium. Her family told she had lost her mind with grief. He spoke of an overseer who had simply disappeared after being dismissed, his body likely food for the gators in the swamp. The stories were warnings, delivered with a calm, deliberate cruelty. He was showing her the consequences of betrayal, painting a vivid picture of the fate that awaited her and her lover if his suspicions were ever confirmed. He was tightening the noose, enjoying her silent, white-knuckled terror. One evening, he came to her bedchamber. This had become a rarity, and his presence filled the room with a dreadful foreboding. He did not try to touch her. He simply stood at the foot of her bed watching her. "You have been looking pale, my dear," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "This pregnancy seems to be a great strain on you. Or perhaps it is your conscience." "I am merely tired, Silas," she replied, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "Of course. We must take every care with the air of Bel Rev. Everything must be perfect. He must be a true Blackwood, in body and in spirit, a perfect reflection of his father." He let the words hang in the air, a threat more potent than any physical violence, a perfect reflection of his father. He was no longer waiting for a confession. He was waiting for the birth. The child itself would be the witness, the judge, and the jury. The baby would either exonerate her or condemn her. From that night on, Alara lived in a state of suspended dread. The child within her, once a source of secret joy, now felt like a betrayer, a tiny enemy who would one day emerge and speak a truth that would destroy them all. Silas's suspicion was a poison that had seeped into every corner of her life, and now it had even tainted the love she felt for her unborn baby. She was trapped in a waiting game of her husband's design, and the final move was 9 months in the making. Jasper Cole felt the master's eyes on him like a brand. Every time he crossed the yard, every time he gave an order in the fields, he could feel the weight of Silas Blackwood's hatred. The verbal assault in the stable yard had been a declaration of war. The master knew. He might not have the proof, but the certainty was there, cold and sharp as a blade. Fear, a constant, gnawing companion, settled deep in Jasper's gut. It was not just for himself. He had faced danger before. He had survived fever, poverty, and the casual violence of the world. But the fear he felt now was a different beast entirely. It was a three-headed monster. Fear for Alara, fear for their unborn child, and fear for his own life. He watched Alara from a distance, his heart aching with a helplessness that was almost unbearable. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. He saw the forced, brittle smile she gave her husband. He knew Silas was tormenting her, playing a cruel psychological game, and there was nothing he could do. To intervene, to even speak a kind word to her, would be to sign their death warrants. The plantation, which had once felt like a place of grim duty, now felt like a prison closing in on him. The air was thick with menace. He started at shadows. A late-night summons to the great house sent his heart into a frantic gallop, though it always turned out to be for some mundane report. He felt the eyes of the other slaves on him, too. They were a silent, watchful chorus. They knew. They saw everything. In their gaze, he saw a mixture of pity and a grim understanding of the planter's wrath. They knew what happened to men, white or black, who crossed the master. His thoughts turned to escape. The dream he had shared with Alara, of heading west, of a new life, became an obsessive, desperate plan. He began to squirrel away what little money he had. He studied the stars, trying to refamiliarize himself with the constellations that guided men north. He listened to the whispers among the enslaved, the coded talk of the Underground Railroad, of safe houses and river crossings. It was a fool's errand, and he knew it. A white overseer running off with the master's pregnant wife? They would be hunted like animals, by slave patrols, by bounty hunters, by Silas's own vengeful fury. There would be no place on earth they could hide. And how could Ilara, a woman who had known only comfort and privilege, survive such a life on the run? How could she bear a child in the wilderness, with no midwife, no shelter? One night, unable to bear the inaction any longer, he risked everything. He left a note tucked into the hollow of a loose brick by the infirmary wall, a place he and Ilara had once designated as a point of secret communication. The note was simple. Swamp. Midnight. He waited for her, hidden in the shadows of the cypress trees, his heart a stone in his chest. He was sure she would not come. The risk was too great. But then he saw her, a ghostly figure in a dark cloak moving silently through the trees. The moment she was in his arms, the words poured out of him in a desperate, hushed torrent. "We have to leave, Ilara. We have to run. Now, before the baby comes. I can get us away. We can go north, lose ourselves. I will work. I will do anything. We can have a life. A real life." She listened, her face pale in the moonlight, her hand resting on her swelling belly. He could see the longing in her eyes, the desperate wish that his plan could be a reality. But he also saw the deep, soul-weary knowledge that it was a fantasy. "And where would we go, Jasper?" she asked, her voice heavy with a tragic calm. "A woman in my condition? We would not last a week. They would hunt us down. Silas would spend his entire fortune to see us dragged back here. And what do you think he would do to us then? What do you think he would do to you?" Her words were a douse of cold water on the flickering flame of his hope. She was right. His plan was born of desperation, not of logic. They were trapped. "He will kill you, Jasper," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "When the baby is born, if it has your eyes, he will kill you without a second thought. He will say you tried to run, or that you attacked him. No one will question him. You will simply disappear." He had known this, of course. He had seen it in Silas's eyes. But hearing the stark, brutal truth from her lips made it terrifyingly real. He was a dead man walking. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, trying to memorize the feel of her in his arms. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but now it was sharpened by a fierce, desperate resolve. "Then I will not let that happen," he said, his voice a low, determined growl. "I will not let him destroy us. There has to be a way. I will find it." But as he held her in the dark, silent swamp, their first sanctuary and now their potential tomb, he had no idea what that way could be. His fear was not just for their lives, but for their love, a fragile, beautiful thing that had bloomed in the most poisonous of soil. And he was beginning to realize, with a dawning, chilling horror, that in the world of Silas Blackwood, such things were not meant to survive. As the seasons turned and autumn began to paint the leaves of the sycamores in hues of gold and rust, a strange and unsettling calm descended upon Belle Reve. Silas, to Ilara's profound confusion, seemed to relent. The sharp interrogations ceased, the thinly veiled threats disappeared from his dinner conversation, and his obsessive watchfulness appeared to soften into a more conventional, husbandly concern. He began to treat her with a detached, almost clinical solicitude. He instructed the house servants to attend to her every whim, ensuring her diet was rich and her exertions minimal. He even purchased a new, more gently sprung carriage for her, insisting that her weekly trips to church should be made in the utmost comfort. To any outside observer, he was the model of a doting, expectant father. Ilara did not trust it for a second. This was not a change of heart, it was a change in strategy. The open warfare of suspicion had been replaced by a cold, silent siege. He was no longer trying to force a confession from her. He had realized he didn't need one. He had decided, with a chilling patience, to wait for the irrefutable proof that her own body would provide. This new phase of their silent conflict was, in many ways, more terrifying than the old one. The overt hostility had been exhausting, but at least she knew where she stood. This placid, courteous veneer was like walking on a frozen lake. The surface was smooth and calm, but she knew that just beneath it lay a deadly, unfathomable cold, and that the ice could shatter at any moment. She played her part in the charade. She thanked him for the carriage, complimented the meals he ordered for her, and allowed him to rest his hand on her swollen belly, a gesture that sent a wave of revulsion through her. She smiled and nodded and played the role of the cherished, blooming wife, all the while feeling the scream that was perpetually lodged in her throat. Her isolation was nearly complete. She had no one to confide in, no one to share the crushing weight of her fear. Even her silent communication with Jasper was severed. Silas had subtly reassigned the overseer's duties, keeping him perpetually on the far side of the plantation. She no longer caught even a fleeting glimpse of him. It was as if he had been erased from her daily existence, a ghost whose presence she felt only in the frantic beating of her own heart and the secret movements of the child in her womb. The house servants watched her with pitying eyes. Old Hattie in particular would find reasons to be near her, offering a cool cloth for her head or a soothing herbal tea for her nerves. The old woman's presence was a small comfort, a silent acknowledgement of her plight. Hattie knew. She did not speak of it, but her gentle knowing gaze told Ilara that she was not entirely alone in her terror. This uneasy truce was a psychological torment. The days bled into one another, each one bringing her closer to a reckoning she could not escape. The baby grew stronger, its kicks and flutters a constant physical reminder of the life she cherished and the doom it heralded. She would lie awake in the dead of night, her hands spread across her stomach, and whisper to the child, begging it for a miracle. Please have your mother's eyes. Or his. Anyone's but your father's. Silas seemed to be enjoying the long, slow game. He had her trapped, not by bars or chains, but by biology and time. He had become the patient spider, watching the fly struggle in the web, confident in the ultimate, inevitable outcome. He would occasionally make a chillingly prescient comment, a reminder that he had not forgotten, that he was merely waiting. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, he looked up from his ledger and smiled at her. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "about my own father. A hard man, but fair. He always said you could tell the quality of a man's stock by his offspring. Blood will always tell, he used to say. The truth is always written on the face of a child for the whole world to see." He held her gaze for a long moment, his eyes devoid of all warmth. In that moment, the truth was revealed for what it was. The calm, deliberate sharpening of the executioner's axe before the final, fatal blow. He was giving her this time, this semblance of peace, to make the inevitable end all the more devastating. The waiting, he knew, was the most exquisite form of torture. The first chill of winter arrived, stripping the last of the leaves from the trees and casting a gray pall over the landscape of Belle Reve. With it came the final stage of Ilara's ordeal, her confinement. According to the customs of the time, the last weeks of her pregnancy were to be spent in quiet seclusion within the house, a period of rest and waiting for the impending birth. For Ilara, it was the closing of the final door, the transformation of her gilded cage into a solitary cell. The world shrank to the four walls of her bedchamber. The sprawling plantation, the distant fields, the secret swamp, all of it was now beyond her reach. Her only view was through the tall, paned windows that overlooked the barren, formal gardens. Silas insisted upon it, cloaking his control in the language of medical necessity. "The winter air is too sharp for your delicate condition, my dear," he'd said, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. "You must be protected, you and my son." Her days took on a monotonous, suffocating rhythm. She would wake, be attended to by a house servant who rarely spoke, and take her meals on a tray in her room. Silas would visit her each evening, a perverse daily ritual. He would inquire after her health with his chilling politeness, his gaze always drifting to her enormous belly. He never stayed long, but his presence lingered like a foul odor, a constant reminder of the impending judgment. Her paranoia, fed by the isolation, grew to a fever pitch. The silence of the house became amplified, every creak of the floorboards in the hallway outside her door sounding like the footstep of the hangman. She felt as though the very walls were watching her, that the eyes of the portraits of Silas's grim-faced ancestors were following her every move. Her only human connection was with Hattie. The old woman was tasked with overseeing Alara's care, and she moved about the room with a quiet, calming efficiency. She would brew teas to soothe Alara's nerves and rub her swollen ankles, her gnarled hands surprisingly gentle. They rarely spoke of anything of substance, but in the long, silent stretches, a powerful, unspoken understanding flowed between them. Hattie had seen generations of Blackwood men and the women they ruled. Her eyes held the deep, sad wisdom of a survivor. One afternoon, as Hattie was folding linens, Alara could bear the silence no longer. The question that had been tormenting her for months finally broke free. "Hattie," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "when the time comes, the babies, do they always resemble the father?" Hattie's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before she resumed her methodical folding. She did not look at Alara. "Babies come out how they come out, mistress," she said, her voice a low, non-committal rumble. "Some favor the ma, some the pa. Some favor a grandparent you ain't never seen. The Lord decides the face of a child." It was not the reassurance Alara was desperately seeking. It was a statement of fact, a surrender to the whims of a fate that had already been sealed. As her time drew near, a strange, almost surreal sense of calm settled over Alara. The terror had not vanished, but it had been worn down by sheer exhaustion, leaving behind a hollow, resigned core. She had played her part. She had endured the waiting, and now the final act was upon her. Whatever was to happen would happen. She thought constantly of Jasper. The inability to see him, to know if he was safe, was a unique form of torture. She prayed that he had had the sense to leave, to run far away from Bel Rev and the Master's inevitable wrath. But she knew he wouldn't. He was bound by his own sense of honor, by his love for her. He would not leave her to face the storm alone, even if his presence meant his certain doom. The night the pains began, a fierce winter wind rattled the windows of her room, howling like a vengeful spirit. Hattie was there in an instant, her calm presence a small anchor in the rising sea of Alara's pain and fear. She sent a young servant to fetch the town doctor and to inform the master. Alara lay back against the sweat-soaked pillows, her hands clutching the sheets. The physical pain was immense, a fire tearing through her, but it was nothing compared to the terror in her heart. The waiting was over. The time for the uneasy truce, for the psychological torment, for the desperate, silent prayers, was at an end. The door opened, and Silas stood there, silhouetted against the lamplight from the hall. He was dressed in his finest clothes, as if for a celebration. He looked at her, lying helpless and in agony in the birthing bed, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. "The time has come, my dear," he said, his voice laced with a chilling, victorious anticipation. The time for all truths to be revealed. He did not come to her side to offer comfort. He simply walked to a chair in the corner of the room, sat down, and folded his hands in his lap. He was not here as a husband. He was here as a spectator, a judge waiting for the final, damning piece of evidence to be presented. And as another wave of pain crashed over her, Alara knew that she was not giving birth to a child. She was giving birth to a verdict. The birthing room became a crucible, a pocket of the world where time seemed to warp and stretch. The storm outside raged in symphony with the tempest in Alara's body. Wind and rain lashed against the glass, and the rhythmic, agonizing contractions pulled and tore at her, each one a wave dragging her further out into a sea of pain. Through it all, she was acutely aware of two presences in the room. Hattie, a steady, murmuring anchor at her side, and Silas, a silent, malevolent statue in the corner. Hattie was a force of nature in her own right. She moved with an economy of motion born of long practice, her low voice a constant hum of encouragement and instruction. "Breathe now, child. Breathe with the pain. Don't fight it. You're stronger than this pain." She wiped Alara's brow with a cool, damp cloth, her touch firm and reassuring. Her presence was the only thing keeping the terror from swallowing Alara whole. Silas, by contrast, was a void. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply watched, his eyes burning with an intensity that felt like a physical weight upon the room. The doctor, a portly, sweating man named Barrows, arrived smelling of whiskey and damp wool. He performed a cursory examination, declared everything to be proceeding as it should, and then accepted the glass of brandy Silas offered him. The two men sat together, their silent vigil a grotesque parody of concerned fatherhood. Hours bled into one another. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Ilara's world narrowed to the crushing pain, the sound of her own ragged breaths, and Hattie's steady voice. She was vaguely aware of the doctor checking on her periodically, his hands prodding and impersonal. But mostly she was aware of Silas. His stillness was more terrifying than any rant. It was the calm of a predator, utterly confident in its victory, savoring the final moments of the hunt. With every fiber of her being, Ilara fought to hold on. She was no longer just fighting the pain of childbirth. She was fighting against the inevitable. She felt as though if she could just hold the baby inside her forever, she could postpone the verdict. She could keep the fragile, impossible peace. But her body had its own agenda, a primal, unstoppable force. "The head is crowning, mistress," Hattie said, her voice firm, cutting through the haze of Ilara's agony. "It's time now. You gotta push, child. You gotta push with all your might." A new kind of energy surged through her, a final, desperate burst of strength. She heard the scrape of a chair as Silas leaned forward, his patience finally giving way to raw anticipation. The doctor moved to the foot of the bed, suddenly all business. Ilara bore down, a scream tearing from her throat, a sound that was equal parts pain and despair. The world went white, then red, then dissolved into a kaleidoscope of unbearable sensation. And then, a sudden, shocking release. A thin, wailing cry cut through the sound of the storm. It was the most beautiful, most terrifying sound Ilara had ever heard. "It's a boy, Mr. Blackwood. A fine, healthy boy," Dr. Barrows announced, his voice booming with false cheer. Hattie worked quickly, her hands sure and steady as she cleaned the infant and wrapped him in a soft linen blanket. Ilara lay back, gasping, her body trembling with exhaustion and a dread so profound it felt like death. She was too afraid to look. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, praying to a god she no longer believed in. "Let me see him," Silas commanded, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. He was on his feet now, his shadow falling over the bed. Hattie hesitated for a fraction of a second, her back to the master, a silent, protective shield. But she could not refuse. With a heavy heart, she turned and placed the swaddled bundle into the master's waiting arms. Ilara forced her eyes open. She watched her husband as he looked down at the face of the child. Silas's expression was unreadable at first, a mask of cold scrutiny. He stared at the baby's tiny, wrinkled face, his gaze intense, searching. The room was utterly silent, save for the infant's soft whimpers and the drumming of the rain against the window. The baby, disturbed by the transfer, blinked his eyes open, trying to focus in the lamplight. And in that moment, the storm broke. It was not a roar of anger that shattered the silence. It was something far worse. A soft, almost gentle exhalation of breath from Silas, a sound of profound, terrible satisfaction. A slow smile, devoid of all humor, spread across his face. It was the smile of a man whose darkest suspicions had been proven correct, whose patient, cruel game had ended in absolute victory. He turned, his movements deliberate, and held the baby out for Ilara to see. "Behold your son, madam," he said, his voice a low, venomous purr. And behold his father's eyes. Ilara's gaze fell upon the child, her child, for the first time. He was perfect, a small, miraculous creature with a dusting of dark hair and a rosebud mouth. But his eyes were wide open, and they were not the muddy brown of Silas's, nor the soft green of her own. They were the color of a summer sky just before a storm. A clear, piercing, and utterly unmistakable blue. Jasper Cole's eyes. The truth was so stark, so absolute. It stole the breath from her lungs. There was no room for doubt, no possibility of a trick of the light or a passing fancy. The child was the living, breathing image of his father. It was a genetic miracle and a catastrophic condemnation, all in one. A strangled sob escaped Ilara's lips. It was over. The months of lies, of fear, of desperate hope, all of it had culminated in this single, silent, devastating revelation. The doctor, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere from celebration to something dark and dangerous, began to stammer. A beautiful child, Mr. Blackwood. Strong lungs. He has his mother's fair features, perhaps. Silas ignored him completely. He continued to stare at Alara, his triumphant smile never wavering. Blood will always tell, he whispered, repeating the chilling words from weeks before. The truth is always written on the face of a child. He turned to Hattie, who stood frozen by the bedside, her face a stoic mask of grief. Take the child, he said, the word dripping with contempt. Clean it, feed it, do what you must, and then confine yourself and the other servants to the kitchens. No one is to leave. No one. Hattie took the baby, her arms wrapping around him in a gesture that was both tender and fiercely protective. She gave Alara one long, sorrowful look, a look that said everything. I am sorry. I will protect him. Before she turned and left the room, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. Dr. Barrows, sweating profusely now, began to gather his things. Well, my work here is done. A successful delivery. If you need anything, Silas, just send a boy into town. You will not be going anywhere, Barrows, Silas said, his voice dropping to an icy calm. You will go to my study. You will sit there and you will enjoy my finest bourbon until I come for you. You have seen a great deal tonight. We must discuss what it is precisely that you will remember of it. The doctor's face went pale. He understood. He was no longer a physician, he was a witness, and his testimony would be dictated by the master of Belrev. He nodded dumbly and scurried out of the room. Now they were alone. Alara and Silas, husband and wife, judge and prisoner. The storm outside had begun to subside, its fury spent. But the storm in the room was just beginning to gather its terrible power. Alara lay in the birthing bed, weak, bleeding, and utterly exposed. Her betrayal was no longer a secret, but a living, breathing infant with his father's eyes, sleeping just down the hall. Silas walked to the window and looked out into the pre-dawn light. The world was washed clean by the rain, but inside the house, a filth had been exposed that could never be cleansed. I have waited a long time for this moment, Alara, he said, his back still to her. I have pictured it in my mind over and over. I wondered if I would be angry, if I would scream and rage and break things as a lesser man might. He turned to face her, and his face was a mask of pure reptilian coldness. But I find I am not angry. I am clarified. Everything is simple now. There is the wrong, and there is the reckoning. And the reckoning, my dear, will be a masterpiece. The cold gray light of dawn seeped into the room, illuminating the wreckage of the night. Alara, shivering despite the heavy blankets, watched her husband. The triumphant glee had faded from his eyes, replaced by a chilling, methodical calm that was infinitely more terrifying than any rage. He was not a man consumed by passion. He was an architect of vengeance, calmly drawing up the blueprints for her destruction. He began to pace the room, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the wide-planked floors. He did not look at her. He was speaking to himself as much as to her, laying out his thoughts, his plans, with a terrifying lucidity. The first order of business is the narrative, he said, tapping a finger against his lips. The story that the world will hear. Dr. Barrows will be most helpful in this. He will attest that my son was born weak, fragile, that despite our best efforts he succumbed to a fever within a day of his birth. A tragedy. The county will weep for us. The Beauforts and the Pembrokes will send condolences. The infant son and heir of Belrev, taken by God before his time. Ilara's blood ran cold. You would not. She breathed, the words catching in her throat. He stopped his pacing and looked at her, his eyes wide with mock surprise. Harm the child? My dear Alara, what do you take me for? I am not a monster. I would not harm a hair on the bastard's head. He paused, letting the silence stretch. But his existence is an insult. He cannot be raised as a Blackwood. He cannot carry my name. He will disappear. There are arrangements that can be made. An orphanage in a distant city, run by stern women who do not ask questions. He will be raised with nothing, knowing nothing of his parentage. A far more fitting fate, don't you think? To erase him from the world, rather than to end him. It was a fate worse than death. To condemn her son to a loveless, anonymous life, to never know his mother, to be cast out and forgotten. A wave of nausea, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. "And what of me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled that terrible smile again. "You, my dear, are the centerpiece of my masterpiece. You will play the part of the grieving mother. Your heart, broken by the loss of your firstborn, will cause your mind to fray. You will become withdrawn, melancholic, prone to fits of fancy. You will live out your days here, at Belle Reve, as my sad, mad wife, a living testament to my Christian forbearance and my unending mercy. I will be seen as a saint for tending to my broken bride, for not casting you out despite your frailties. Your cage is no longer gilded, Ilara. It is now made of pity and whispers, and you will never, ever leave it." It was a brilliant, sadistic plan. He would not just punish her, he would erase her. He would turn her into a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered on verandas across the county. He would rob her of her sanity, her reputation, and her son, all while burnishing his own image as a long-suffering, honorable man. "And him?" she asked, the name sticking in her throat. "What of Jasper?" Silas's face darkened, the first flicker of genuine rage showing through his cold composure. "The overseer, the stud I hired to manage my fields, who saw fit to plow my own wife." He walked to the bedside and loomed over her, his voice dropping to a low, savage growl. "His fate will be more direct. His reckoning will be a lesson to every man, black or white, who ever dares to look at what is mine. I will deal with him myself. Tonight, down by the swamp. There will be an accident, a terrible, tragic accident. He will be found, days from now, half-eaten by gators, a fitting end for an animal." Ilara's heart stopped. She saw it all, laid out before her with horrifying clarity. Her son, vanished. Herself, a prisoner in her own home, declared insane. And Jasper, the only man she had ever loved, condemned to a brutal, lonely death in the dark waters of the swamp. Silas had thought of everything. He had sealed every escape route, closed every door. He would control the narrative, the people, the very truth itself. He was the master of Belle Reve, and his power was absolute. He seemed to sense her surrender, her utter, abject despair. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her sweat-dampened forehead. His touch was cold, proprietary. "Rest now, Ilara," he said softly. "You have a great performance ahead of you, the role of a lifetime." He turned and left the room, closing the door with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in the silence, the sound of a tomb being sealed. Ilara lay there, staring at the ceiling, the full weight of his reckoning crashing down upon her. He had left her with nothing but the ashes of her life, but as the minutes ticked by, a tiny, defiant ember began to glow in the darkness of her despair. He thought he had won. He thought he had taken everything, but he had forgotten one thing. He had left her with Hattie, and in a world ruled by powerful men, the secret, silent power of women was a force he had dangerously underestimated. The ember of defiance in Ilara's soul was fanned into a flame by a mother's desperate primal love. She would not let Silas win. She would not let him destroy her son and the man she loved. Lying in that bed, she felt a clarity she had never known. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. She knew she had only hours. Silas would be occupied with the doctor, with spinning his web of lies. He would wait until the cloak of full darkness to enact his final brutal revenge on Jasper. That was her window. When Hattie returned with a bowl of thin broth, Ilara grabbed the old woman's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Hattie, you must help me," she whispered, her eyes wild with urgency. "He is going to kill Mr. Cole, tonight, and he is going to send my baby away." Hattie's face, a mask of weary sorrow, showed no surprise. She had likely pieced together the master's plan from his orders and the suffocating tension in the house. "Ain't nothing we can do, mistress," she murmured, her voice filled with a lifetime of resignation. "The master's will is like the river. It goes where it wants. You try to stand in its way, you just drown." "No," Ilara insisted, her voice gaining strength. "He has underestimated us. He has underestimated me. I am a mother. I will not let him do this." She looked Hattie in the eye, her gaze pleading. You love that child. I saw it in your face when you held him. I know you do. Help me save him. Help me save them both. For a long moment, Hattie was silent, her dark eyes searching Alara's face. She saw not the flighty, privileged plantation mistress, but a woman transformed, a lioness ready to fight for her cub. She saw a glimmer of a chance, a sliver of hope in a hopeless world. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. The alliance was sealed. Their plan was desperate, forged in whispers in the sick room while the master plotted in his study. It was a plan built on Hattie's knowledge and Alara's sacrifice. First, Hattie slipped away, a silent shadow moving through the house she knew better than anyone. She went to the kitchens where the other servants were huddled in fear. She spoke in low, urgent tones, using the authority she commanded. She called upon old loyalties, upon the shared hatred of the master, upon the simple human desire to protect an innocent child. She procured a small, sturdy basket, blankets, and a precious bundle of food, dried meat, a hunk of bread, and a flask of clean water. Then she sent for Jasper, not directly, but through the plantation's invisible network of communication. A message was passed from a house servant to a stable boy, from the stable boy to a field hand working near the overseer's cottage. A single coded phrase: "The master has business in the swamp tonight. You are not to be there." It was a warning and a summons. He was to be at the northernmost edge of the property, by the old hunting trail, an hour after sundown. The hardest part fell to Alara. She took the pen and ink that Hattie brought her, and with a trembling hand, she began to write. Her first letter was to Jasper. It was a torrent of love and heartbreak, a confession of everything. She told him of Silas's plan, of her own fate. She told him that their son's name was Nathaniel, a name she had whispered to him in the womb, meaning gift of God. She begged him to take their child and run. "Do not grieve for me," she wrote, tears blurring the ink. "My life was over long before this day. My only regret is the life we could not have. Live for me, live for him. Raise our son to be a good man, a man like his father. Go north. Do not stop. Do not ever look back. My love for you is the only true thing I have ever known. It is my gift to you, and Nathaniel is my proof. Survive. That is all I ask." The second letter was for Silas. It was her confession, a final, defiant act of war. She laid the blame for everything at his feet: his cruelty, his coldness, his tyranny that had driven her into another's arms. But she twisted the truth, creating the diversion that Jasper and Nathaniel would so desperately need. "I could not bear to live without my child," she wrote. "You sought to punish me, but you have only set me free. We have gone, my lover and I, and our son. We are heading south to the port at New Orleans, where a ship awaits to take us away from your grasp forever. By the time you read this, we will be long gone. Do not try to follow us. You will never find us." It was a lie, a desperate misdirection. She knew Silas's pride. His first instinct would be to ride south, to the port, to catch the fugitives who had so brazenly defied him. It might only buy Jasper a day, perhaps two, but a day's head start to the north could be the difference between life and death. As twilight fell, Hattie brought Nathaniel to her, swaddled tightly. Alara held her son for the first and last time. She drank in the sight of him, memorizing his tiny features, the soft down of his hair, the startling blue of his eyes. She kissed his forehead, her tears falling onto his cheek. It was the sharpest pain she had ever known, a tearing of the soul. To save him, she had to give him up. It was a mother's ultimate choice, a sacrifice of unimaginable proportions. "I love you, Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Always." She placed the letter for Jasper inside the baby's blankets. Then, with a final, wrenching sob, she handed her son back to Hattie. Hattie took the child and the basket. "God be with you, mistress," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you, Hattie," Alara whispered. "Keep him safe." Hattie slipped out into the gathering darkness. Alara was alone. She smoothed the letter for Silas and placed it prominently on her bedside table. Then she lay back and closed her eyes. her heart a gaping empty wound. She had done all she could. She had sacrificed her own future for theirs. She had turned her body into a shield, her love into a weapon, and her despair into a plan. Now, all she could do was wait for the reckoning to come for her. Hattie moved through the night like a spirit, the sleeping child a precious, warm weight in her arms. She knew the secret paths of Belle Reve, the trails that wound through the darkest parts of the woods, far from the patrolled lanes. She was an old woman, but tonight she was fueled by a fierce, righteous purpose. She met Jasper at the appointed spot, a ghostly figure emerging from the gloom. His face was a mask of confusion and terror until he saw the bundle in Hattie's arms. She pushed the basket into his hands, along with Alara's letter. "She saved you," Hattie whispered urgently. "She saved the boy. Now go. The master is being sent south. You run north. Don't you stop for nothing. The life of this child is in your hands now." Jasper looked from Hattie's grim face to the sleeping baby, his son. He unfolded the letter, his hands shaking as he read Alara's words in the thin moonlight. A strangled sound of pure agony escaped his throat. He understood the totality of her sacrifice. She had given him their son, and she had given him his life, at the cost of her own. He fell to his knees, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. "There ain't no time for grieving," Hattie said, her voice hard, but her eyes soft with pity. "Grieving is for later. Living is for now. You owe it to her. You owe it to this baby. Now get up. Go." Jasper looked up, his face streaked with tears, but his blue eyes held a new, steely resolve. He nodded, clutching the basket to his chest as if it were his own heart. He gave Hattie one last look, a look of profound, eternal gratitude, before melting into the darkness of the forest, a ghost running toward the North Star. Hattie returned to the great house. An hour later, Silas, his face a mask of thunderous rage after finding Alara's letter, assembled a party of men. Just as Alara had predicted, his pride and fury overrode all other logic. He and his men thundered off the plantation on horseback, their lanterns swinging wildly as they galloped south, toward New Orleans, on a fool's errand. In her room, Alara heard them go. A profound, hollow peace settled over her. Her part was done. Her son was safe. Jasper was safe. That was all that mattered. When Silas returned days later, empty-handed and consumed by a cold, simmering fury that was far more terrifying than his hot-tempered rage, he found her exactly where he had left her. She did not fight him. She did not scream. When he accused her, she simply looked at him with empty eyes. He put his narrative into motion. The story of the stolen, dead infant was told. The whispers of the mistress's madness began. Alara was confined to the upper floor of the house, a prisoner in a silk dress. She became the ghost she had feared she would, a pale, silent figure seen occasionally through an upstairs window. Her world shrank, but she did not break. In the silence of her gilded prison, she held on to the memory of a stolen moment in the swamp, the feel of her baby in her arms, and the image of a man with eyes the color of the sky. Years passed. The nation was torn apart by a great war, a war that ripped the foundation out from under Belle Reve and the world Silas Blackwood had built. The master lost his fortune, his power, and eventually his life, struck down by a stray bullet from a skirmish that had spilled onto his land. Alara lived on, a quiet, forgotten woman in a decaying mansion. One day, long after the war was over and the world had changed forever, a letter arrived. It bore no return address and was postmarked from a small town in Ohio. It had been sent to the local church, with instructions to deliver it to the woman who still lived at the old Blackwood place. The letter was written in a child's careful, developing script. It was short and simple. "Dear Madam," it read, "my father told me to write to you when I was old enough. He said you were a kind woman who helped him once long ago. My name is Nathaniel. My father says I have my mother's spirit. He says she was the bravest woman he ever knew. He says I have his eyes. We have a small farm now. It is hard work, but it is good. He is a good father. I hope this letter finds you well." Alara held the letter to her chest, her hands trembling. The words were a balm on her scarred soul. A whisper of hope carried on the wind across a great distance. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. Her son was alive. He was safe. He was free. She went to the window and looked out at the world. She was still a prisoner, but her heart, for the first time in a lifetime, could fly. It flew north, to a small farm in Ohio, to a boy with dark hair and a brave spirit, and to a man with eyes the color of a summer sky just before a storm. In the quiet ruin of her life, she had found her faint and distant hope, and it was enough.